After successfully mastering a few of the geomancy spells that he'd been learning from Hades, Krivax should have been in a relatively good mood. Unfortunately, it was hard to feel happy when you were about to participate in a highly dangerous ritual. Participating in rituals was never something that Krivax would have had to worry about before the creation of the Anomalous Magic Research Division, but things had changed a lot over the past few months. As Krivax walked through the tunnels of the Nerubian enclave in Dalaran, while making his way to the enclave's ritual chamber, he couldn't help but look around and take in those changes. After all, the enclave's significant expansion significantly affected Krivax's day-to-day life. Where before the tunnels had been rather sparsely populated by a few Nerubians who were sent to learn magic in Dalaran, they were now constantly active with viziers and initiates moving about their business. There were also several of the High King's dread stalkers stationed in the enclave, presumably to surveil them, but Krivax couldn't see any as he made his way through the tunnels. Masruk, at least, was enjoying their company and he was definitely learning a lot from them. Krivax had noticed that his friend was generally in a better mood recently now that he was let into the secret and had more people to spar with. He had expected that a Nerubian would be sent to watch over them as well, given that he was one of the High King's most trusted subordinates, but the Spider-Lord was apparently too busy assisting with Azrael Nerub's war effort. "It's a shame he isn't here. I think I'd probably have an easier time getting along with a Nerubian than most of the viziers." It was likely Azrael Nerub would have preferred to send even more personnel to the enclave, but there was a limit to what Dalaran would accept. If there were too many Nerubians in the enclave, then they would eventually become an unacceptable security risk to the city. The only reason that they had actually been allowed to send so many viziers was probably due to a combination of the ongoing war and the threat of Deathwing. Dalaran's Nerubian enclave had now become the center of Azrael Nerub's efforts to combat the Void's influence in the Eastern Kingdoms. Most of those efforts had been dedicated mostly to research for the first few months, given that they needed to avoid attracting Deathwing's attention, but circumstances had changed a few days ago. To be more specific, circumstances changed a few days ago when a massive wave of Void energy suddenly rippled over the Eastern Kingdoms. Only those who were familiar with what the Void was knew what they were sensing, but even people who were magically insensitive reported feeling as if something horrible was going to happen. The feeling of an impending catastrophe had only gotten stronger since that moment, and Azrael Nerub was working closely with Dalaran and the Dragonflights to figure out what was going on. Several seers had attempted to look into the future in an attempt to gather information, but those who were lucky enough to not be driven insane had simply failed to learn anything definite. Everyone who was in the know could tell that Deathwing was likely responsible for whatever was happening. The predominant belief was that Deathwing had probably managed to release some kind of ancient void-corrupted monstrosity, but it seemed like nobody really knew for certain. Despite his meta-knowledge, Krivax was just as ignorant as everybody else. The original timeline had already diverted so completely that much of what he knew had become completely useless. I guess hoping that the insane void-corrupted dragon would have been content to just spend the past few months twiddling his thumbs was a bit too optimistic. Davil Prester had failed to do anything beyond what he was already doing, and everyone had started to hope that they would be able to find the dragon's soul and confront him before he could put any of his plans into action. Unfortunately, it seemed like Deathwing was a few steps ahead of them and had managed to secretly pull something off under everyone's collective noses. It felt incredibly unsettling to know that Deathwing might have released some kind of ancient horror due to the choices that he had made. After taking a moment to banish his pessimistic thoughts, Krivax decided to focus on the things that he could actually do to help rather than worrying about things that he couldn't change. Once it had become clear that their division wasn't making any progress in learning more, Krivax had made a suggestion to everyone that they should perform one of the more complex divination rituals created by the Order of Kalchut. The other viziers would not normally listen to the opinions of someone as young as him, but Hades had agreed with his suggestion and pushed for it as well. They had already previously attempted to use this ritual to find the location of the dragon's soul, but it had rather predictably failed to find anything. It was as if the dragon soul didn't exist in the first place as far as the magic was concerned. There was no guarantee that the ritual would succeed this time around either, but everyone was starting to get desperate for information despite the obvious dangers of attempting to scry what was likely a powerful void entity. Krivax had wondered at first why Hadix hadn't used this ritual during all of the other times that he had been investigating the void, but it apparently could only be cast through the cooperation of several mages on top of a powerful leyline nexus. Those things had obviously not been available in the Eastern Kingdoms in the past, but circumstances had obviously changed. It sort of made Krivax glad that the order had been exposed and that people were now being forced to cooperate openly. Krivax was pulled out of his thoughts as he finally reached his destination. Previously, Krivax had been too busy with his diplomatic duties to participate in any rituals, so it was actually his first time seeing a Nerubian ritual chamber. The cavern that had been dug out for the chamber was several times larger than any other room that Krivax had seen in the enclave. Geometric and carefully placed webbing had been weaved throughout the entire cavern using magic-conducting silk, making the whole thing appear like it was some kind of three-dimensional arcane diagram to Krivax's senses. There were also 4 glowing obelisks in each corner of the room that were being suspended in the air through a combination of webbing and thin spars that looked similar to spider legs. Using his magical senses, Krivax could tell that the obelisks were drawing arcane energy from Dalaran's leyline nexus and directing it into the ritual web. Krivax looked up to the roof of the cavern and saw several viziers making minute adjustments to the web. After taking a moment to look around, Krivax spotted Hadix directing a few of the viziers on the other side of the cavern. As one of the strongest members of the Order and the only one who had any experience with the Eastern Kingdoms, it was unsurprising that Hadix had taken up a leadership role in the new division. Hadix called him over the moment that he spotted Krivax. "Vizier Krivax, your assistance in spinning the ritual weave would be appreciated over in this section." Krivax quickly skittered his way onto the webs and began heading in Hadix's direction, using his magical senses to study the ritual weave the entire time. While the ritual weave in its entirety was beyond his ability to understand, Nerubians generally tried to develop their rituals to be as logical and modular as possible. The ritual weave was carefully spun with plenty of spaces within it where different weavings could be added or removed depending on the goal of the ritual without interfering with the base formation. "Vizier Krivax, I would like for you to take over for these fools in spinning these portions of the arcane modulation weaving," said Hadix, glancing disdainfully at the 2 viziers who he had been directing. "The 2 of you can go wait quietly for the ritual to begin. I don't want to waste any more time fixing your tedious mistakes." Krivax glanced at the section that Hadix was referring to and found it to be rather simple. Did they really have problems with this? One of the viziers, whose name Krivax hadn't actually learned, immediately took insult to Hadix's words. "Vizier Hadix, you can't possibly be serious. Are you truly going to replace us with this hatchling? I trust this hatchling to correctly spin the weave more than I do you," Hadix said dismissively. "While you 2 have spent the past century allowing your skills to deteriorate to an embarrassing degree while you played politics, Vizier Krivax has been constantly improving his skills with consistent determination. I'll listen to your complaints once you remember how to properly cast magic." The pair of viziers looked like they were about to argue, but a single caustic glare from Hadix sent them both storming off while silently fuming. "Vizier Hadix, are you sure about this?" Krivax asked with trepidation. "I'm sure that those viziers must be a lot older than me. Shouldn't they be better at this kind of magic than I am?" Hadix snorted in amusement before answering. "What you failed to take into consideration is that there were many members of the Order who were recruited for reasons other than their magical ability. Those 2 have spent most of their lives as administrators, and the only magic that they consistently cast is likely a few cleaning spells." Krivax hadn't actually taken that into account, but he still found their inability difficult to believe. As someone who wasn't really only 6 years old, he could actually conceptualize how much more life experience people who lived for centuries had compared to him. Had they really failed to pick up any magic at all in that time? When he brought up his doubts to his mentor, the older vizier actually had an explanation that Krivax had never considered before. While the higher castes are given a significantly longer lifespan than most Nerubians, our ability to retain memories is not increased to a proportional degree, Hadix patiently explained. Even we viziers, though shaped for intelligence and problem-solving, lack perfect recall. It's a trait the queens have yet to consistently apply. Krivax was kind of surprised that he had never thought of that, and it seemed obvious to him in hindsight. Although he had noticed an improvement in his intelligence after being transformed into a vizier, that improvement was actually relatively minor. Magic wasn't like a video game, where once you learned a new spell you were guaranteed to be able to cast it for the rest of your life. Expecting a vizier to successfully cast a spell that he hadn't used in centuries was kind of like expecting someone to be proficient in the calculus skills that they learned in high school after decades of never finding a use for it. Do not misunderstand, Krivax. Those who have lived for a long time still hold a significant advantage over those with less experience, said Hadix, his words becoming cautionary. There are spells that can assist a mage in retrieving memories, and consistent use of arcane magic has a tendency to increase intelligence and recall. Even the most untalented of mages can become formidable if they consistently work to improve themselves for centuries. Krivax had no doubt that was the case. After finishing his impromptu lecture, Hadix once again instructed Krivax to begin working on the weaving and then left to go oversee the work of the other viziers. The work was relatively straightforward, and Krivax even lost himself to his work until he suddenly realized that the ritual was almost ready to begin. Krivax watched as the viziers took up specific positions throughout the cavern and began preparing themselves and nervously moved to do the same. Hadix had already explained how things would work, and most of them would simply be providing their own power to the ritual while also helping to properly guide the magic. There were only a few who would be doing the actual work of casting the divination ritual. Specifically, the difficult portions would be handled by a seer in the center of the ritual weave as well as a few of the more experienced viziers, which naturally included Hadix. If everyone is prepared and has taken their positions, then I will begin the ritual, called out the seer in the center of the weave. Krivax could feel his anxiety growing by the moment now that the ritual was actually about to begin. The purpose of this ritual is to divine information about the surge in void energy that has been slowly growing over the past month. While these are not our lands, the void is a threat to all Nerubians, and this new threat must be handled for the safety of our people. I expect you all to do everything that you can to ensure this ritual is successful. With his speech concluded, the seer didn't hesitate to begin the ritual. Every vizier in the room, including Krivax, immediately started channeling their magic into the weave, causing the entire cavern to light up with a violet glow. Although Krivax wasn't able to understand what spells the more experienced viziers near the center were casting, he could tell that they were extremely complex divination spells. The seer looked as if he was just staring off into space, but Krivax could sense waves of intense magical energy flowing from him. This process went on for several minutes until Krivax suddenly noticed inexplicable images forming in his mind, much to his surprise. He had already been informed that something like this would happen and that it was simply a sign of the ritual working, so Krivax only panicked a little. The ritual was designed to show scenes of the past, present, and future of their void-corrupted target, and although the vast majority of those scenes would be directed toward the seer, every mage participating in the ritual would occasionally see a few as well. It made Krivax sort of glad that he wasn't actually a seer because he couldn't imagine the training that they would have to go through to handle being bombarded with so much information. Krivax tried to focus on them, but the images flashed by too quickly for him to accurately interpret any of them. As the ritual progressed, however, they began to appear with more frequency and stay around for much longer. Be warned. We approach the most dangerous portion of the ritual, the seer called out, pulling Krivax away from his thoughts. The entity whose nature we are attempting to divine has noticed our efforts and is beginning to probe our defenses. Sure enough, Krivax felt his heart drop as he saw several portions of the ritual weave growing dark with the void. According to Hadix, This was one of the primary reasons that the Order rarely chose to use these kinds of rituals. Large portions of the weave were dedicated purely to intercepting any incoming attacks and preventing the ritual from being interrupted. Krivax could sense the incoming images growing in frequency and clarity, all the while something on the other side was gradually increasing the strength of its attacks. He distantly noted that the chamber was beginning to grow darker due to the increasing presence of the void. Krivax could feel a malevolent gaze settle over him and the other viziers, and he knew without a doubt that whatever they were looking for was now looking back at them. Thankfully, it seemed like their defenses were powerful enough to hold it back for now. After a few more minutes of this, the images being produced by the ritual became clear enough that even Krivax was able to understand a little of what he was seeing. He almost immediately wished that wasn't the case. Almost immediately, Krivax felt like someone was trying to push a knife into his brain and he was forced to look away. He wasn't able to make out much in that short moment, but he could tell that their target was large, and it had been involved in some kind of war. It was also incredibly powerful and felt as if it had been made from the void itself. Krivax could tell from the expressions of the other viziers that they were having similar difficulties. What the hell has Deathwing unleashed? Just as he finished strengthening his mental shields and was preparing himself to look again, Krivax was interrupted as the ritual suddenly ended. The source of the problem was obvious once he looked to the center of the ritual weave and saw the seer convulsing on the web with streams of blood pouring from his orifices. Although he wasn't particularly surprised, the macabre scene didn't fail to fill Krivax with an intense feeling of dread. Once he realized how powerful their target was, he knew that they had gotten in over their heads and things were going to go incredibly wrong. Krivax had almost expected the walls to start sprouting tentacles and for mind-destroying terrors to pop out of thin air. The chamber turned into a flurry of movement as soon as everyone realized what had happened and started implementing their contingency plans. The seer was swiftly taken away to see Queen Kithix in order to receive medical attention, but Hadix doubted that there was much that could be done to help them. According to him, it was likely that the seer's mind had already been destroyed long before they started convulsing. Almost immediately after the seer was taken away, the participating viziers gathered together and shared what they saw during the ritual in hopes that they could put together a coherent picture while memories were still fresh. Unfortunately, it quickly became clear that their efforts wouldn't be producing many useful results. The vast majority of the visions had been directed to the seer, who obviously couldn't provide his testimony. There weren't very many people who saw more than Krivax had, and they could barely agree on what they had seen. Many people reported that they had seen a large number of trolls, but that didn't really tell them anything. After nearly an hour of frustrated arguments, it was decided that the ritual had mostly been a failure. They had all but confirmed that the source of the increased void energy was some kind of massive monstrosity, but they didn't really learn anything else. Krivax tried to rack his brain for any useful meta-knowledge, but the details were still far too vague for him to work with. Maybe I should find a way to get my hands on another memory elixir. They're really expensive though, and I'm not sure I'll be able to get anything out of it anyway. As Krivax left the ritual chamber and began making his way to his room, he found himself feeling more terrified and uncertain about the future than he had felt in a long time. Krivax dreaded to consider what someone like Deathwing could achieve with enough time now that he no longer cared about subtlety. He desperately hoped that the changes that he had made to the timeline wouldn't end up causing more people to die. Krivax had known from the moment that he had made the conscious choice to change things that it was possible for history to turn out worse, but everything had sort of turned out mostly fine for him up until this point. The longer that Deathwing was allowed to roam free, the worse things would get for everyone. Malygos sneered in disgust as he examined the orc in front of him. The creature was sitting in front of a campfire and cooking some manner of bird while speaking to another one of its kind. Although Malygos had primarily infiltrated the horde with the intention of finding the dragon soul, another one of his goals was to verify some of the information in the letter sent to Crossus. The letter claimed that the horde were pawns of the Burning Legion, and Malygos could conclusively determine that to be true. He likely wouldn't have noticed if he hadn't been looking for it specifically, but he had plenty of experience with detecting fell magic, and every single orc that he had examined possessed significant amounts of it in their system. Such high concentrations of fel were probably the source of the unnatural strength and resilience of the orcs, as well as their extreme aggression. It may even be the source of their green skin. Malygos found his mind wandering to the information provided in the letter given to Crossus. Whoever had written it had only given a very general overview of the Horde's history, and what had driven them from their world. Apparently, an orc by the name of Gul'dan had sold himself into the service of the Burning Legion and betrayed his people. He then launched a campaign of careful manipulation to spread the Burning Legion's demonic magic and turn his people into bloodthirsty monsters. The orcs' homeworld was now almost completely ruined by fel magic, and they were now invading Azeroth in hopes of establishing a home to replace the one that they ruined. There was obviously much that the letter's author had failed to mention in their explanation, but it was still valuable information, and Malygos suddenly found himself curious about their identity. The writer had been decently competent in hiding their traces, but hiding from anything as powerful as an aspect was not a simple endeavor by any means. Malygos had no doubt that Nasdormu had simply traveled to the past and secretly watched the author write the letter with his own eyes while looking over their shoulder. Personally, Malygos thought that it was most likely one of Deathwing's spawn who had sent the letter. Not out of any sense of moral goodness like his siblings might think, but because his fallen brother's spawn were as power-hungry and treacherous as Deathwing himself, so one of them would take every chance they could to undermine him for their own ambitions. Traitorous scum. Unfortunately, Nasdormu had been more firm than usual when he insisted that nobody search for the letter's author, at least for a few more months. They apparently needed to remain undisturbed until then for something important to the fate of Azeroth to take place. Malygos wasn't one to blindly listen to Nasdormu's words, especially when he knew that his brother was far from omniscient, but it was only a few more months and he knew the aspect of time was right more often than not. Malygos turned his attention back to his current object and began making his way through the orc camp in the direction of the Twilight Hammer clan, completely unseen to the camp's inhabitants. Currently, they were camped nearby Zulaman, and Malygos had learned through searching the minds of a few orcs that they were relatively isolated from the rest of the Horde. That didn't surprise him. Despite being equally malevolent, those who served the Burning Legion and those who worshipped the old gods rarely cooperated with one another. The Twilight Hammer clan was assisting with the Horde's ongoing assault on Quel'Thalas and was stationed relatively close to the front lines. Malygos, however, found it difficult to care about any of this when he knew that the war would be ended as soon as the dragon soul was no longer a factor. The dragonflights would not normally interfere with a mortal war, but there were too many greater forces involved in this conflict for them to ignore it. It wasn't long before Malygos could sense the presence of the void begin to increase as he approached his destination. He also started to notice several feral-looking orcs with pale skin walking aimlessly through the camp. Where the green-skinned orcs were full of fel energy, these paler ones showed clear signs of being corrupted by the void. After another few minutes of walking, Malygos spotted the emblem of the Twilight Hammer clan crudely painted onto what appeared to be a flag made of leather. Malygos felt a wave of disgust as looked at the thing. He was experienced enough to distinguish between the leather of an animal and the leather of a mortal. Having found his target, Malygos strengthened the magic hiding his presence and walked into the camp of the Twilight Hammer clan with a greater degree of caution. Nelthorion was many things, but he was not an idiot. Malygos had no doubt that if the dragon soul was truly in the Twilight Hammer clan's possession, then it would be extremely well protected. Malygos fully understood the risk that he was taking, and the catastrophic consequences that would occur if he was captured. Just because he had decided to take that risk didn't mean that he would do so without caution. He'd sooner kill himself and obliterate the entire Horde in an arcane explosion rather than give Nelthorion the satisfaction of placing chains around his neck. Of course, it would be far sweeter to end Nelthorion's life with his own claws. Malygos wanted to watch the despair in his eyes as he saw all his plans and ambitions burn before him. Malygos shuddered in barely suppressed glee at the thought and forced himself to focus on his current task. He began to thoroughly search the camp for any sign of the dragon soul, while also keeping an eye out for the clan's chieftain. Unfortunately, the pale orcs hardly ever spoke, and Malygos did not wish to risk searching through the minds of the void-corrupted creatures. Doing so would almost guarantee his exposure. It was thanks to the camp's nearly complete silence that Malygos found his attention being drawn when he heard somebody speaking. They were talking in the native language of the orcs, but it had taken Malygos a mere few seconds to learn the language after ripping it from the mind of an isolated orc scout. Chagall, when is your disgusting little book going to provide us with more dragon corpses? Those damned griffin-riding dwarves are slaughtering my warriors. I need more dragons. Soon, Warchief. Soon. The Great Master was silent for a time, but they have now returned. The Twilight Canticle will lead the horde to new dragon corpses soon. Pray that it does, Chagall. My patience with you is nearly at an end. Malygos watched as a large green-skinned orc stormed out of a large tent with a furious expression. A distant part of his mind recognized the orc as the leader of the horde, but most of Malygos' attention was directed toward the tent rather than the irrelevant mortal. Chagall was the name of Twilight Hammer clan's leader, and he was also the mortal who was most likely to be in possession of the dragon soul. After waiting a few moments to see whether or not Chagall would exit the tent, Malygos decided to go inside himself. The nature of his invisibility spell made it rather complicated to cast a silent teleportation spell, and he didn't want to draw attention by disturbing the tent flap, so Malygos instead cast a spell that turned his body intangible and simply walked inside. It only took a single look at Chagall for Malygos to be certain that the creature was one of Deathwing's minions. Nobody aside from the old gods themselves would have been able to so thoroughly empower the ogre with the void. Malygos had seen a few other examples of two-headed ogres during his walk through the horde camps, but none of them quite looked like Chagall. Not only did the mortal have several black spikes growing all along his body, but there were also multiple large eyes growing across his bare chest. It was a rather extreme example of void corruption, and Malygos found himself surprised that the ogre was still moderately coherent. He was so engrossed in studying the ogre that Malygos failed to notice the female orc until she spoke. Once she did speak, however, any thought of studying the mortal was banished from his mind and his undivided attention turned to her. "You did well placating the orc, Chagall," said the female orc. "Father will be pleased to hear of your continued competence. A black dragon. And she's one of Neltarian's spawn." Malygos could feel the world shrink to just him and the black dragon in front of him. He completely ignored whatever response came from the ogre as he imagined himself killing Neltharian's child, just as his family was killed in front of him. Malygos didn't know whether or not the creature that was once his brother would even truly care if he did, but the call for vengeance nearly consumed all rational thought. It would be so easy. While Neltharian's children were all fairly powerful in their own right, Malygos had the advantage of surprise, and he was much larger than they were. It would only take him a moment to reveal his true form and end her. Kill her. Let Neltharian feel the pain of losing his daughter. As Malygos pushed through the bloodlust and tried his best to rationally consider his options, he noticed that 2 more male orcs had entered the conversation. Most likely more of Neltharian's spawn. Malygos tried to focus on what they were saying, but he felt like his mind was in a fog and every thought led back to violence. Kill them all. Take your revenge. As had recently become a force of habit, Malygos subconsciously cast a spell on his mind to check for the void and was shocked out of his murderous thoughts when the spell confirmed that he was being influenced. No. I refuse to follow in Neltharian's footsteps. Malygos used all the willpower he possessed to pull himself back together and push away any thoughts of killing the black dragons in his midst. If he revealed himself in a mad attempt to kill Neltharian's children, then it was incredibly likely that he would have found himself at the mercy of the dragon soul. Malygos already knew that it must be here. There was no other reason for so many of Neltharian's children to be present unless they had been ordered to protect it. His theory was eventually confirmed after spending a few minutes listening to their conversation. "Have you made progress in controlling the artifact, Chagall?" said the smaller of the male orcs. Malygos wasn't familiar enough with Nelarian's recent children to recognize him. Of course. I'm grateful for the honor that the Great Master has bestowed upon me by giving me such a sacred duty. Humph. So long as you understand your place, mortal. You will not like the consequences if you attempt to use it against your betters, said the larger orc. A part of Malygos wanted to stay and see where in the camp they were keeping the dragon soul with his own eyes, but he knew that it would be too dangerous. His objective had already been completed, and it would be better to leave before anything unexpected occurred. He had gotten everything that he needed to finally achieve his vengeance against Nelthorion, and he wouldn't allow his own recklessness to ruin everything. As Malygos made his way out of the camp and felt the void eating away at the spell keeping him hidden all the while, he knew that he had made the correct decision. Once he found a relatively isolated location, Malygos immediately cast a spell to teleport himself away so that he could bring the news to his siblings. Now that the location of the dragon soul had been found, the time had come for them to finally launch their assault on Deathwing. The only thing that was left to do was organize the mortals and plan the attack. And finally, this would all end. Krivax could feel his heart racing as he and Masruk made their way as quickly as they could from capital city to Dalaran. There were several human travelers on the road who screamed and panicked at the sight of two giant spider people running past them, but Krivax ignored them. Of all the times for them to find the dragon soul, it just had to be on the day I'd be away from Dalaran. Ever since the failure of the ritual, Krivax had been trying his best to figure out the identity of the void creature released by Deathwing. Plenty of people more capable than himself were already investigating, of course, but none of them had the advantage of meta-knowledge. The only problem was that he had no real way of remembering such obscure lore after so many years, and getting his hands on an elixir that could help him recall such old memories wasn't exactly easy. Instead, Krivax had just decided to look into any old god-affiliated forces in the Eastern Kingdoms to see if he could jog his memory, from Ragan Rose and his dark iron dwarf servants to any reported sightings of Naga. After failing to achieve any results, Krivax eventually decided to head on over to Capital City and see what he could learn from the Explorers League. Given that Azrael Nerub had every intention of developing relations with Ironforge and Nerubian after the war, getting permission for his trip had been a fairly simple matter. The Explorers League had also been more than willing to help, especially after Azrael Nerub shared several important documents containing information about obscure sightings of the Iron Dwarfs and Frostborn in Northrend. Considering what Malygos had already told everyone, Krivax had no doubt that historians across the Eastern Kingdoms would be obsessing over all the information that had come out recently. While the Explorers League lacked access to the majority of their documents as they were currently being held in Ironforge, they still had many subject matter experts who were able to assist Krivax. He had spent hours going over several subjects, but it was only when he began to read old legends about Tirisfal that Krivax felt like he was close to remembering something important. Unfortunately, Masruk had chosen that exact moment to inform him that the Council of Six was calling for an emergency meeting. The location of the dragon soul had apparently been found, and everyone who had been informed of the situation was headed back to Dalaran so they could begin planning the assault on Deathwing. Krivax was really glad that Dalaran and Capital City were built so close to one another because he really didn't want to keep a room filled with some of the most powerful people in the world waiting. After using his diplomatic credentials to quickly pass through security, Krivax and Masruk both slowed down a bit to catch their breath as they made their way to the Violet Citadel. Someone must have sent word ahead that he would be coming because the receptionist quickly let him through and a few tense guards escorted the two of them to the portal leading to the Chamber of Air. Krivax wasn't surprised that the guards were tense. If the dragon soul had really been found and everyone was meeting to plan the attack on Deathwing, then the Chamber of Air was probably busier today than at almost any time in Dalaran's history. Not only would the entire Council of Six be in attendance, but also several more archmages as well as many viziers. It wouldn't be long before rumors started spreading that something significant was happening in Dalaran. "This is as far as I will go," said Masruk once they reached the portal. I've received instructions from the division to go to a heavily warded building near the Violet Hold and wait with the Dread Stalkers for further orders. I don't know what exactly they have planned, but it feels like they intend for things to happen quickly and I need to meet with them soon. Krivax felt like that was likely to be the case. Now that they had found the Dragon Soul, it was important that they act swiftly and discreetly in order to minimize the possibility that Deathwing's agents would catch wind of something and inform him. I understand, said Krivax, nodding to his closest friend. We'll probably get the chance to speak again before everything starts, but if we don't, just be sure to take care of yourself, Masruk. Hadix had made it explicitly clear that Krivax was more than likely going to be participating in whatever plan they came up with. His mastery of magic had reached a point where Krivax wouldn't make himself a hindrance, and this was important enough that everyone involved would be expected to help. If Masruk was going with the Dread Stalkers, then there was no doubt that he would also be fighting. It was very likely that the two of them were both approaching the most dangerous moment of their lives. I will, Masruk said solemnly. You take care of yourself as well, Krivax. Krivax watched Masruk leave until he disappeared around the staircase leading to the Violet Citadel's exit. After taking a moment to pull himself together and calm down, Krivax stepped through the portal and entered the Chamber of Air. It took a few seconds for him to shake off the typical disorientation that came with teleportation and take a look around the room. Krivax almost immediately froze once he realized that he had become the center of attention of everyone present, but that thankfully didn't last for very long. After all, everyone seemed to be much more interested in listening to Alexstrasza and Malygos, both in mortal form, yelling at each other in the center of the room than in paying attention to a random vizier who just arrived. The other two aspects were also wearing their mortal forms as they stood to the side. Ysera quietly stared at Malygos with a judgmental expression on her face while Nasdormu simply took everything in with a serene smile. Krivax felt a shudder go through his body as Nasdormu seemed to study him longer than everyone else, but the moment passed once the aspect of time eventually turned his attention back to the argument. I don't understand why you can't acknowledge that your actions were completely and utterly irresponsible, Malygos. Did I not succeed in finding the Dragon Soul? You should be thanking me, Alexstrasza. We couldn't afford to wait for whatever half-hearted measures you would have eventually decided on. And what if you hadn't succeeded, brother? Asked Alexstrasza, her voice filled with exasperation. Are you truly so willing to risk the fate of Azeroth for your vengeance? If something had happened to you while you were searching for the Dragon Soul, then there's little that we could have done to save you. I wouldn't have needed to take such risks if you had simply agreed with my initial proposal, said Malygos, glaring at his fellow aspect. It was your soft-heartedness that made this necessary. Krivax felt distinctly like he was watching something that he shouldn't be and discreetly made his way over to where the few Nerubians participating in the meeting were gathered. Aside from Vizier Hadix, Vizier Krenis, and Anubakan, there were a few other vaguely familiar members of the division. Azrael Nerub was taking the Deathwing situation very seriously and had sent a few of its most combat-capable viziers to assist Dalaran's archmages in securing the Dragon Soul. Have I missed anything important? Krivax quietly asked Hadix as soon as he was in speaking range. What are they arguing about? From what I've been able to gather, Malygos apparently decided to go find the Dragon Soul himself without informing anyone, Hadix drawled, not pulling his eyes away from the arguing dragons. They've been yelling at each other for nearly half an hour, but nobody wants to be the one to interrupt them. After Malygos' last meeting with the Council of Six, Krivax wasn't surprised that nobody wanted to do anything that might set the mad dragon off. Seeing as the meeting had yet to truly begin, he decided to use the opportunity to look around and take note of who would be participating. After taking a quick glance around the chamber, Krivax saw that every member of the Council of Six was already present, as well as 3 humans and an elf, none of whom Krivax recognized. The humans must be the other archmages that Antonidas mentioned would be joining in the attack, Krivax mused to himself. The elf is probably Prince Kael'thas' right-hand man, Magister Romarth. It was a shame that Quel'Thalas apparently hadn't sent anyone else, but given that the Horde had recently forced the elves to activate the impenetrable shield that protected Silvermoon, it was to be expected. King Anastrian probably couldn't afford to send out his most important mages right now. After he finished looking over the mages provided by Dalaran, Krivax turned his attention to the dragons. So that's what a night elf looks like. Logically, Krivax would have expected the aspects to take on forms most similar to the night elves, given that they were the oldest variety of elves and were much longer lived than trolls, but most of them actually looked similar to the high elves of Quel'Thalas. Ysera, however, chose to take on a tall, horned, muscled form that was based on her most ardent followers, the night elves of Kalimdor. I'm pretty sure most night elves don't actually have horns, Krivax thought to himself as he took in Ysera's form. Krivax quickly glanced at Hadix before turning his attention back to the dragons. He had no doubt that everyone had noticed the discrepancy and was forming their own theories. After all, the elves of Kalimdor looked significantly different than Krivax had expected from their cousins in the Eastern Kingdoms. Although he would never say it to their faces, Krivax could immediately believe that the night elves had evolved from trolls. Aside from their purplish skin tone, which was fairly similar to that of many troll tribes, the night elves were also significantly taller and appeared more muscular than both humans and high elves. Krivax really hoped that Azul Nerub would establish good relations with the night elves when they sent an expedition to Kalimdor. He really didn't want to fight an army of muscular 7-foot-tall Amazonians. Nozdormu's appearance was simpler in comparison, as he just looked like a high elf. Krivax wasn't sure who the male elves standing beside Ysera and Alexstrasza were, but they were most likely their various consorts. Enough, Alexstrasza. If you must continue berating me for something that has already been done, then do it when we are alone, said Malygos, looking thoroughly frustrated with the situation. There's no need to continue putting on such a display in front of the mortals. We have more important things to be discussing. Very well, Malygos. But this discussion isn't over, said Alexstrasza, much to the relief of everyone in the chamber. Finally, good, said Malygos as he turned his attention back to the rest of the chamber. I can see that everyone has already arrived, so I think it's about time that we began. Time is of the essence, and we will need to move quickly if we wish to minimize risks to our plan. I agree, said Alexstrasza, still sounding faintly exasperated. Krivax could feel the tension in the room increase as everyone realized that they were finally about to get to the matter at hand. For those of you who are not aware, the dragon soul was recently found to be in the possession of the chieftain of the Twilight Hammer clan, the two-headed ogre known as Chagall. The Twilight Hammer. They are the ones who have been using shadow magic to attack my people, correct? Prince Kael'thas asked solemnly. That's correct, elf, said Malygos, conjuring an image of Chagall with a wave of his hand. Their leader is a two-headed ogre whom Nelthorion has apparently empowered with the void. He will not be easily killed by you mortals, especially with several black dragons guarding both him and the dragon soul. However, I believe that our current plans have a good chance of succeeding. Although there were many details that couldn't be finalized until we found the dragon soul, we've been planning for this assault from the moment that we became aware of the situation, said Crossus, his tone polite as he spoke to his secret superior and mate. I believe that it would be best to go over our general plan for those who are unaware of it before moving on to specifics, Queen Alexstrasza. That sounds wise, Archmage Crossus, said Alexstrasza, sounding equally as polite. Krivax stifled a chuckle as he watched the two lovers act as if they had never met before. Our attack will happen simultaneously in two different locations. My fellow aspects, consorts, and I will be attacking Deathwing in his mortal guise of Davil Presta. According to reports, he should currently be in his manor located in northern Lordaeron. I assume that you wish to attack him at the same time that we are securing the dragon soul so that he cannot intervene? Asked Hadix. That is one reason, but there is also another, said Alexstrasza. When Nelthorion created the dragon soul, he did so in such a way that made sure it could never be used against him, but Malygos was able to discover while studying it shortly after its creation that doing so created an unintentional vulnerability. Our goal is to use the fight to acquire a fragment of his body and then transport it to your location so that you are able to destroy the dragon soul once and for all. Once that has been done, then our full power will be restored to us and we will be more than capable of defeating him. And putting an end to him once and for all, Malygos added darkly, his expression becoming murderous. Your full power? Kel'Thuzad asked curiously. Krivax suddenly began having flashbacks to the last time that Kel'Thuzad was asking dangerous questions with a murderous Malygos in the room. Thankfully, Alex de Rustzer seemed to have expected the question and merely nodded before responding. As I'm sure my brother has told you, Deathwing was once one of us, but his duties proved too much for him to bear and he was corrupted by the old gods, said Alexstrasza, her voice filled with sorrow and regret. Before we learned of this, he created the dragon soul and claimed it was a tool to help us better do our duties, asking for a portion of our power each to empower it. Because of this, we are much weaker than we once were and thus it would be difficult for us to defeat him, even working together. Krivax didn't need his meta-knowledge to know that Alexstrasza was leaving a lot out from her explanation, and he was certain that he wasn't the only one. After all, why would the aspects think that an anti-dragon artifact would help them better do their duties? However, nobody was interested in questioning the Dragon Queen about an obviously sensitive matter and the discussion quickly moved back to planning the assault. Although the portion of the plan involving Deathwing was relatively straightforward, the same couldn't be said for those who would be going after the dragon soul. Not only would they need to successfully take it from a void-empowered Chagall and multiple extremely powerful black dragons, but they would also need to survive long enough for a fragment of Deathwing to be transported to them. Neither of those objectives would be easy, especially since the battle would be taking place deep behind enemy lines. If we wish to be able to transport a fragment of Deathwing as quickly as possible, then we will likely need to establish a portal connection between the two battles, Malygos said once they started discussing logistics. Krivax had a feeling that the dragon had been thinking of solutions for this problem for quite a while. However, it would be too dangerous for the portals to lead directly between each location, otherwise we risk our enemies exploiting the opportunity to take the dragon's soul to the aspects. A better course of action would be to establish two separate portals to a heavily guarded location and have one of the consorts transport the fragment as quickly as possible. Krivax considered it and found that the plan made sense. Having the portals lead to a heavily guarded location would prevent Chagall from running through with the dragon's soul and causing problems, and having a consort transport the fragment meant that the aspects wouldn't need to. There was only one real issue with the plan that Krivax could see. While I'm certain that creating a portal between the battlefield and Dalaran would be an extremely simple matter for you, I'm afraid we mere mortals are not quite so skilled, said Hadix, saying what was on everyone's mind. Unless you happen to be the aspect of magic, creating a portal would normally take a significant amount of time and require the mage to be able to lock onto the intended location. This could be done by either working with another mage or by targeting a pre-established location that had been clearly marked with special wards. While Malygos could probably instantly create a portal from his location to the heavily guarded location, the Dragon Soul retrieval team would need a decent amount of time to accomplish the same thing. You mortals will simply have to manage if you wish to have any hope of saving this world, Malygos said with an annoyed expression. Whichever mortal is assigned to create the portal will need to be protected long enough to succeed in doing so, all while several black dragons as well as waves of void-corrupted orcs are trying to kill them. I understand that this won't be an easy endeavor, but you should have already known that to be the case before you came here. The room fell quiet at the Malygos words, but it wasn't long before Krivax could see a wave of determination fill everyone present. Although they all valued vastly different things, Deathwing was an existential threat to everything they held dear. Since that was the case, there was nothing that they could do other than fight with everything they had to put an end to him. Malygos must have liked what he saw because he nodded with a satisfied look on his face before continuing. Good. Now that you mortals have gotten over your useless complaints, let us discuss the actual details of the attack. The forces protecting the dragon's soul are considerable, so the battlefield will need to be tilted as much as possible in your favor. The next 20 minutes of the discussion were dedicated to planning on how they would actually get their people to the Twilight Hammer clan without having to fight the entire horde. Several plans were proposed, from simply having everyone walk there from the Alliance camps under a giant invisibility spell to having the Blue Dragonflight provide everyone with flying carpets from their vault. The Horde has yet to show that they have any way to effectively detect the tunnels, and the underground tunnels would be a defensible position from which the assault team can create the portal, Anuba Khan proposed. There are few races in Azeroth more deadly than Nerubians when fighting in tunnels. Although Chagall or the Black Dragons would almost certainly detect the portal and figure out what was going on as soon as they actually started to create it, the assault team would have ample time to lay traps beforehand in the tunnels. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I was led to believe that these Black Dragons have some manner of control over the earth, said Archmage Modera, her voice filled with skepticism. They do, Malygos quickly confirmed. Although they've rarely used those abilities since they became corrupted, according to what I've been told by members of my flight. Hadix scoffed disdainfully before responding, our kingdom wouldn't have lasted as long as it has if we couldn't prevent any random quake or upset geomancer from collapsing our tunnels and cities. If our protections were strong enough for us to survive the sundering, then I think we can protect ourselves against the geomancy of a few dragons. If you're so confident, mortal, then show me, said Malygos. Hadix immediately cast a rather efficient and effective geomantic ward which quickly spread through the ground. The ward was one of the first spells that Krivax had learned once Hadix decided to teach him geomancy. Given their living environment, it wasn't a surprise that Nerubians placed such importance on safety when learning such magic. After a few moments of evaluation, Malygos nodded and gave his approval. It wouldn't last more than a few minutes against Nelthorion, but it should be sufficient to protect against his spawn, especially if they are under attack. After confirming that it was safe, it wasn't long before everyone agreed to Anuba Khan's suggestion. Once they settled on how they would get there, the discussion moved on to assigning duties to each member of the assault team. Anuba Khan would obviously attract the attention of the largest dragon that he could find and trade blows with them, but it wasn't so clear what everyone else would be doing. After spending another 20 minutes arguing, they eventually reached an agreement on the best way to handle things. Vizier Kreenis would be the one to open the portal, as she had significant experience with spatial magic while also being relatively inexperienced when it came to combat. The most powerful individuals would be assigned exclusively to fighting off the most dangerous threats, which were most likely Chagall and Deathwing's children. This elite group included Anuba Khan, Antonidas, Prince Kael'thas, Kel'Thuzad, and Hadix. Given that they didn't know how much danger Kreenis would be in, most of the other archmages and viziers would be moving freely between defending her and assisting in dealing with Chagall and the dragons. The least experienced and the weakest members of the team would be exclusively assigned to protecting Kreenis, which included Krivax and the squad of dread stalkers they brought along with them. Krivax was honestly glad to hear it because he had no doubt that he would probably end up dying in seconds if Onyxia or Chagall turned their attention on him. I'm not sure if this has been addressed, but do we have any plans on how to deal with whatever void creature was released by Deathwing? Asked Krivax, forcing himself not to flinch when every eye in the room turned to him. If he can control it, then it seems likely that he'll send it to start causing problems once we attack him. Krivax didn't actually know how likely that was, but it seemed like something that would happen once everyone ran off to fight the big bad. We have indeed thought of that, Vizier Krivax, which is why I will be staying in Dalaran, said Crossus. Krivax hoped that was true, and that the secret dragon wasn't just going to follow the aspects as soon as everyone left. I will be here to handle any potential emergencies that might occur. With his concerns addressed, Krivax stepped back and everyone's attention turned to Kel'Thuzad, who had stepped forward. This is all well and good, but what are we to do if one or both of our attacks fail? Asked Kel'Thuzad, instantly bringing down the mood of the room. If Deathwing is as powerful as you say, then it's very possible that you might fail to acquire a fragment of his body. It's also quite possible that Vizier Kreenis will be killed before she can successfully create a portal to Dalaran. With the stakes being as high as they are, We must create contingencies in case of our failure. Nobody liked thinking about their possible failure, but Kel'Thuzad was undoubtedly correct. Failing to consider any potential plans for such scenarios would be extremely irresponsible of them. The details of any contingency will depend greatly on what exactly goes wrong, said Alexstrasza after a moment of silence. If we succeed in acquiring the dragon soul but fail in obtaining anything that can be used to destroy it, then that would be the simplest situation to handle. While Deathwing is quite powerful, he would eventually be worn down by the combined might of our flights, as long as he cannot use the dragon soul to deal with us. Although, I imagine we would all be dead in that situation, Malygos said with a careless tone. I have absolutely no intention of leaving without tearing off a piece of that traitor. If events happen the other way around and we lack the dragon soul but have the fragment, then whoever has survived will simply need to regroup and try again, Alexstrasza said grimly. Krivax had no doubt that not everyone would be coming back from this alive, but it felt much worse to hear that same sentiment coming from the aspect of life herself. And if both our assaults are complete failures, then we can only hope that the people of Azeroth will rise to the challenge in our stead. Krivax could tell that wasn't what anyone wanted to hear, but what else could be done? There was a lot riding on their success, and no amount of planning would be able to fix things if they failed completely. However, if we succeed in our mission, we can turn our attention to the other forces that threaten Azeroth, said Alexstrasza, her expression firm as she swept her gaze through the room. While my people rarely interfere in the matters of mortals, I swear to you that the Horde will no longer threaten your people once the dragon soul is no longer a concern. Not only will we owe you all a great debt for aiding us against Nelthorion, but the Horde itself is being directed by malign powers wishing to weaken Azeroth. Our flights will make certain that they are driven back to the Dark Portal and see this war is ended as soon as possible. The Dragon Queen's promise quickly raised back the spirits of almost everyone. It was difficult to overstate how much damage the Second War already had done to the Eastern Kingdoms thus far, and everyone was eager to see it end. With most of the major points already agreed upon, the rest of the meeting went relatively quickly. It wasn't long after that before everyone began filing out of the Chamber of Air and Krivax and the assault team started making their way to the portals that would take them to the Alliance's frontline. Given how quickly they needed to move and how far the Jormungand needed to take them, it was decided that they would begin the assault as quickly as possible. Most of the group took separate paths so that they would draw as little attention as possible, but Hadix insisted that the two of them walk to the portal room together. He only found out why once Hadix pulled him to the side and presented Krivax with a plain-looking bracelet that radiated potent arcane magic. A vizier as young as yourself would not normally participate in a battle as dangerous as this one, but circumstances are not always as we would prefer, said Hadix, handing the bracelet over to Krivax. This artifact is enchanted with a variety of potent defensive spells that should hopefully keep you alive. Use it wisely, apprentice. As Krivax put the bracelet on one of his lower arms, he could instantly feel a powerful arcane shield surrounding him. While the artifact wouldn't make him invincible, it would significantly increase his odds of survival and was incredibly valuable. Krivax knew that Hadix wasn't the kind of person who would appreciate a big show of emotions, so he simply filled his voice with as much sincerity as he could before thanking his mentor. Thank you for this, Vizier Hadix. I understand the value of this artifact and I'll do everything I can to survive this battle. Hadix simply nodded to Krivax stoically before turning around and continuing to the portals. After taking a moment to gather his resolve and look at the artifact that had been gifted to him, Krivax followed after him, fully prepared to face the dangers ahead. I have to be. Not just for me, but for everyone, Krivax resolved in his mind as he moved forward with his usual worry, but also with a determination to see things through.